Welcome back, Euro family. So I'm going to try to finish up today the remaining Industrial Revolution notes so that we can kind of put this topic behind us. So let's finish up the Industrial Revolution by looking at how it got broken. What happened to society? How did it fall apart? And the first place we're going to look at is the income inequality for the 99%. I'm sorry, I had to do it one more time. But it really is kind of the early story of the Industrial Revolution is this chart here, right? We've got kids under 10 years old working in mines and factories. It's madness. I can't imagine my kids that I have right now working in factories and mines. One, because I don't think they would listen or do it, but two, they're so sweet and tender. And the other thing that you should notice, right, is that men, adult males, made a lot more money than children and their female counterparts. All right. And so as families needed extra income, they were literally forcing their children to work in mines and factories so that the families would have income. But again, I mean, that was kind of this catch-22 because they didn't make as much as the men. And other things that we notice, right, is, let's be honest, the industrial landscape of England is disgusting, right? England had been famous for being beautiful and green and luscious, and now it looks like this, some sort of futuristic hellscape with these giant smokestacks belching out pollution. It's gross. It's just gross. And so pollution became a real issue. And so here's the silent highwayman talking about the amount of death, the stalking pollution that was the city of London. They actually had a specific cartoon created called Father Thames, which was a personification of the grime and sludge, the death that had become the river flowing through the capital of London. Right, poor people wouldn't even want to bathe with this water because it would do more harm than good, right? Other problems that we notice, right, the amount of drunkenness, the amount of crime, imagine the amount of prostitution and crime taking place in these cities, but they were filthy. Right, you'd have a public water pump 3 feet away from a sewage dumping station. I mean, it's no wonder why cholera and STDs ran rampant through the cities. And until the middle of the 19th century, London didn't even have a police force. And then eventually they created the Metropolitan Police, and that solved some problems. And then you had John Snow with the Broad Street Pump, figuring out that, like, we actually need clean public water. And then Chadwick decides that we need to, have sewer systems to get rid of filth. And so the problems are eventually going to get solved, right? The other problem we run into is criminals. There wasn't much for rehabilitation. It was harsh punishment, beatings. For orphans, for the poor and the destitute, largely they were crammed into workhouses, poorhouses. There was no charity for any of these people. And so it was, in essence, almost like free slave labor for these middle-class factory owners. All right, and so just kind of giving you more of what the urban landscape would have looked like. Now, if you can think in your mind of, a nice Charles Dickens novel, if you can think of like A Christmas Carol, I personally like the Muppet version most, but you can also think of Oliver Twist. Please, sir, I want some more, right? Scrooge is a perfect classical liberal. He is Malthusian as hell. All right. So as they're like, please, sir, would you donate? The poor would rather die than live in these poor houses and prisons. And his response is, well, they better get busy dying and decrease the surplus population, right? That is the hell of the industrial landscape. Thank you, Dickens, for the insight. And the government largely wouldn't do anything. They left it to philanthropists and churches, mainly like the new Methodist Church, that really were kind of viewing themselves as responsible for being like Christ and going and helping the destitute in these cities. We flash forward to a couple politicians into the future, and a guy named William Gladstone, a prime minister of England, would actually get busted at a prostitute's apartment, and he claimed that he was there trying to offer her advice and charity, not for the sex. Some things never change, naughty politicians. They should have locks instead of zippers on their pants. Naughty boys. Okay, so other societal concerns as the income inequality grows, right, you have the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and they're getting more and more power and affluence and control, and the poor seem to be getting poorer and falling apart. And so that previous slide was just some recap. So here are some other ways that people tried to fix the problems. We have the Luddites, all right, those who followed Ned Ludd, all right, this like mythical, almost like Robin Hood figure who lived in the forest and told these men in a romantic kind of way. And I don't mean romantic like, bro, let's kiss. But I mean like romantic as in like romanticism. You know what's disgusting? The dehumanization of machines. So let's get some big old hammers and beat the hell out of machines. Ah, the Luddites. It's creative. And so all around in the middle of England, they went around smashing the frames, as they were called, the frame smashers or the swing rioters. Clever names, England. Clever names. All right, but it got so bad that there were literally bounties placed on these Luddites, and they faced serious jail time. The rewards given when this was serious stuff. In a nation like England, where it was a federal crime to sell secrets about technology or copyrights, you can imagine that destroying the cogs of industry would be a negative thing. All right, now we're going to look at this next concept. It's a little bit confusing, but it's really important to understand, and it's known as the Corn Laws. All right, so in 1804, what happens is some of the wealthier members of Parliament, so that's an MP, a member of Parliament, passed the Corn Laws. And what that does is it blocks the nation, any importer, from bringing in foreign grain or corn until the domestic price has hit 80 shillings per quarter unit, which means that they're artificially blocking cheaper food from entering the country. Now, why would they do this? Because they wanted to make sure that their own agricultural production was making as much money as possible. But that is hypocrisy. These middle-class guys are supposed to be classically liberal, right? Hands-off, laissez-faire economics. Then how can you say we won't import cheaper grain? That sounds like mercantilism. It's hypocrisy, and the people know it. And so people like John Potter and others, right, they organize demonstrations. Things known as the Chartists start to become popular, and they agitate for reforms. Okay, and so one of these great demonstrations was a meeting at a place called St. Peter's Field in the outskirts of Manchester, a great industrial area. And they were there to hear speeches from some great, kind of more radical Republicans asking for universal suffrage. And the town constable freaks out and sends in several regiments of drunken guards, and they butcher the innocent protesters as they were there advocating for a vote. And that convinces other people that asking government for reforms would simply never work. You can't beg because they don't need you. Common people were disposable. All right. And so it convinced some people that they had to push harder. But the Chartists believed that the best way to reform was to try to advocate for universal male suffrage. And that was their goal. They wanted a new constitution or an amendment to the government that would allow all men the ability to vote. It would equalize voting districts and rotten boroughs, which we'll talk about again in a second. But this idea that a place like Manchester or a place like Liverpool that have massive urbanization, huge populations, they should have more votes than a rural township of 300 farmers. So I've got 10,000 workers, 300 people. Why do they have the same representation? That seems unfair. And they also wanted then the secret ballot so that there could be no retribution to employees if they voted for policies that went against the factory owners or their bosses. Very clever they were. Okay, so then moving along, another group called the Anti-Corn Law League develops, and you can imagine what they're arguing for. They're arguing for lowering the price of food, maybe even having benefits for unemployment, or trying to find ways to increase economic output so that all people had a chance to connect. This would be a lot like almost like the EU or something like fair trade initiatives, where we see that like this concept of like there could be a brotherhood, a community, right? A peaceful world if we were all trade partners and equally able to interact. All right, now there's two ways to look at this. We've already talked about Malthus before, and I know most of you guys get it. But on one hand, you had the classical liberals, people like Malthus, who believed in true scientific supply and demand, right? And as long as there's a lot of laborers, they're going to get paid nothing. If there were less laborers, they'd get paid more. And so if people really want benefit, they should die off in some sort of global pandemic where people are forced to hide in their basements and do PowerPoints via screencast. We're going to be okay, guys. I think. Supporters of Malthus would be people like David Ricardo, another classical liberal. I got click happy. He wrote something called the Iron Law of Wages that basically said either close your legs or expect very few paychecks. All right, and so he challenges the poor, right, to this concept of supply and demand, and the demand for labor stays relatively stagnant, but the supply is going up, and so the value is then going down. On the flip side, there were others who argued that government needed to get involved. More radical, not quite socialist yet, but someone named John Stuart Mill is really the most famous of the utilitarians. And this marks a pivot in government, right? That government's job was to actually look out for the greatest number of people in society. And that means that government had to get involved and actually actively protect us and our rights and our safeties. That kind of is a continuity, a connection contextually back to the Enlightenment and this idea of a social contract and that government works for the people. And if the majority of the people that government is working for need something, then government must respond effectively. All right, now that's not quite the general will, and it's also not quite pure democracy. It's a little bit unclear, but it's somewhere in between, but in a more Republican manner. There were others, though, that completely thought that this was fallacy. A guy by the name of Robert Owen up in Scotland owned New Lanark, an industrial town where he believed that if factory owners treated their employees nicely, right, they could provide schools for education, doctors, stores with fair prices, better wages in their factories. And so, like, you'd have a closed, almost bubble community where the people were taken care of. But sadly, it didn't work out, and a lot of people didn't like this idea. And so the unhappy Santa Claus of Germany, right, Karl Marx, who I've been to his house, by the way, fantastic. Karl Marx had a different view, a different reality that he saw, and basically what he saw, right, was that the only way to get any sort of real reform was global workers' revolution. That the proletariat must rise up, break their chains, take down the bourgeoisie, and eventually abolish property ownership and establish a communal control of all things. If you want more, there's a little link down here with Marxism explained. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to take you on home with the last little bit in a separate video. All right, I'll see you soon. All right, so let's finish this thing up. All right, so at the worst case scenario, you could say that the governments of the Industrial Revolution did as little as they could or as little as they possibly had to. That might be slightly unfair. There were reform-minded people that did try to use the government as a tool to help the suffering of the population. And so what I'm going to show you here, right, are some examples of Parliament getting involved in the lives of everyday people. And so if we look at a couple of these things, right, so the abolition of slavery across the British Empire in 1832, and what that really does is it forces there to be pay wage earners, and it sets the tone, I guess, across the empire that, like, labor has value. And this is a theme that we'll actually notice a little bit later. You guys will look at some documents connected to Karl Marx and Abraham Lincoln, and that's one of the arguments that they're kind of making there as well. All right, so then they hold this thing called the Sadler Commission. They get a bunch, like literally hundreds of maimed and horribly treated children from around the empire, and they have them give testimonies, and what they find out is, oh my God, this is bad. This is shocking stuff. Like, we got little kids getting, literally killed and maimed in factories. And so what they did is they passed the Factory Act of 1833, which restricted the age of laborers, the amount of hours a kid could work, and it also then put the government in control of the situation by putting, in essence, commissioners or government agents to go and like report on how the mines and factories are doing. And also, it made sure that the mines provided educational opportunities for their workers. All right, and then eventually we look at some other things down here, like improving charity. This Reform Bill of 1832 was supposed to increase the amount of votes. It largely kind of misses the mark. So let's look at that one a little bit more. I mentioned before this concept of a rotten borough. So if we go to the map, right, here's all these different little industrial cities speckled around in England. You've got a debate, I guess, brewing, right, between Tories and Whigs, and the Tories are afraid that the more votes you give to common people, the worse it will be for their political reality. But even there, you've got both sides of the bench eventually recognizing that they've got to bring about reform or their politics will become irrelevant. Okay, and so these rotten boroughs was this idea that like out in the middle of nowhere, right in Anglia here, some farm area might have one vote, and then all of Manchester, all of Liverpool, for example, would also only have one vote. And so there you go, 35 have 300 voters or less, but a place like Liverpool is 11,000, and that's still only one vote. And so the Reform Bill was supposed to expand upon that. In reality, it only does a little bit, right? It increases some votes, but the way it's tallied still doesn't necessarily mean that those people get greater representation because of who's casting the votes. Eventually, by the end of the century, we do get to the Reform Bill of 1888, for example, and then we've got all men casting votes. Right? And so when we look at like the greater context of the continent, right, England was easily the clear leader. The Netherlands was pretty close. And then eventually, when we get to the second industrial revolution, then we'll notice the continent playing a much larger role. Prussia and northern Germany, for example, areas around Berlin and Hamburg, experiencing a lot of industrialization. Eventually, by the end of the century, getting to the turn of the century into the 20th century, Russia desperately trying to industrialize. Got a nice little pocket of industry and railroading going on in northern Italy as well. That will play a role in Italian unification. And that's what I mean. Look at that little hub of trains there. I mean, it looks like the varicose veins of a fat mama industry on the continent. Look at all of that. But England, what dense industrialization thanks to the railroad. But each of these, rail lines that are like little arteries carrying the nutrients, the blood, the oxygen, the life force of industry across the continent. And as rail expands, so too do towns and shift of population. And then where there's towns, there's factories. And then you can connect areas of resources and coal and mining in with those towns. And then, right, it's exponential growth. And as you can see, eventually, it trails all the way out here. So by 1880, we're getting even into Russia. And so what does it really look like? The world's economy, the industrial economy, is still dominated by Europe. Right? America plays a heavy role, but I mean, Europe is easily, the dominant continent in the global economy at this time. South America, Africa are largely being picked over in the wave of new imperialism. They're being sucked up for cash crops and resources. And so that's kind of going on. So what are the last final trends that we notice to bring this thing on home? Well, as the second industrial revolution rolls on, we notice greater state ownership or nationalization of industry. So, for example, in Germany, in Russia, right, you have the government either owning the railroad or doing contracting and giving like exclusive monopoly rights to certain engineers and companies so that the rail is in unison with the agenda of the government, right? We notice that tariffs will start to creep in, and that's an issue. So those corn laws, for example, where it puts an artificial barrier on prices, that's not good for the economy. And ultimately, that undermines some of the goals, the hopes and dreams of the Congress of Vienna, because even though we're not fighting war, we're fighting tariff wars. And that's going to lead to some real friction between countries, right? National banks like the Bank of England, like the Bank of France, thanks Napoleon, right, are helping those countries navigate and accelerate the economic climates just so much faster. And so we've got that. And then greater legal attention to, the accumulation of wealth is certainly a reality. So companies having to have public books and follow laws, even antitrust policies by the time we get into the 20th century. We'll look at some of that in the next unit. And even some like social reforms, socialist policies. So like having a postal service in England, having, free public water and sewer, and eventually in Germany, when they're created in the 1870s, Bismarck brings about social welfare programs and retirement policies and workman comp benefits and all that kind of stuff. And it really will then lead to a new dimension to nationalism and growing communism, right? And the friction that may exist between those. So in Germany, as they try to figure out their post-Napoleonic reality, they all agree that they should use the same money. They should all be able to trade with other German states, and that builds German nationalism because it's a free trade zone. And so I would rather trade with other German states because I pay less. But in doing so, it forms these bonds, cultural bonds, economic bonds, language bonds that eventually makes them vision a unified German state as opposed to, continuing to be fractured little pieces. And so it's a step towards nationalism. All right, well, hopefully that brings us full circle for industrialization. We'll start looking at the greater backlash to industry when we move into romanticism, right? But that will be for a later time. All right, well, thanks and have a great day.